I work in Australia. I run a cooperative research centre, which is an Australian government initiative that was set up in 2012. Just as many Australian cities have come out of a significant drought situation, and many of the cities that have come out from a drought situation really came out of it through a period of significant floods. And it clearly highlighted to many, including government, the vulnerability of urban environments to the extremities of water. As you would imagine, you either don't have enough of it, or you have too much of it, or when you do have it, the quality is such whereby it severely impacts on the quality of the environment that you live in. I'm not familiar with the New Zealand scene other than hearing the conference proceedings the last 2 days. And one of the things that struck me was that New Zealand, the water industry is at the very cusp of some significant reform. What I hear, political will from the speeches from the two ministers, what I hear, a great vision from some of you here. And I'd just like to reflect and share with you some of the journeys and the opportunities that are presented to us in terms of looking at reform and looking at transformation of cities through the way we manage water and looking at seizing that opportunity, but also to perhaps reflect on some of the potential pitfalls when you do have those opportunities. So I'm going to title my presentation as around the notion of recognizing and being prepared when the catalysts for change do come about. And at the same time, perhaps point out that little diagram to the top up there in terms of the notion that having a vision, having good policy in itself is not enough. In fact, so often well-meaning policies fall flat on its face because of our inability to operationalize the vision and the policy. And there are many different paths to reform, and that yellow line you see there is, of course, our desired pathway. So often you find that if we implement reform too quickly, the system we have, both in terms of the social, the institutional systems, and our capacity to deliver reform, in fact, are not there. And it could, in fact, lead to incredibly traumatic times in terms of our industry that would lead to a system breakdown. And we all don't want that. But we also find that sometimes if we actually embrace the vision and the reform too quickly, we don't implement it well, some problems arise, and it creates this major backlash whereby a good idea and a good concept and a good policy can get thrown out altogether simply because of poor implementation. Certainly my journey over the last 20, 30 years in the water industry have shown me that the way we implement reform, we have to accept that the only way forward is through partnership, because problems in implementation will occur. The way we address them is really fundamental to whether that reform is going to be successful or not. And that is through partnership, whereby there is no finger pointing, but actually coming together to learn and respond to the problem and do better and progressively build that way. That's my experience, and I believe that that is really the way that good reform really takes hold and gets mainstream. And then there's reform whereby we start off with the greatest of aspirations, and then the debate comes in, and the progressive death by 1,000 cuts. And it's all very much driven by many of us being really comfortable in our space, doing the same thing that we do, and we follow what we call a path dependency lock-in. We simply want to do the same, but perhaps make it more efficient, or perhaps to tinker around the edges. And you find that, yes, we do get reformed, but that reform itself is actually not transformative. It merely continues to perpetuate the path dependency of your existing system. That is also fraught with danger, because one of the things that we need to do is that the danger of path dependency is actually continue to lock in deeper and deeper our vulnerability to the uncertainty that we face. which to some degree is the very catalyst for the reform in the first place. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'd like to start my journey by basically talking about how the CRC for Water Sensitive City and the concept of water sensitive urban design really came about in Australia. And I'll start off with this diagram in here, which is really what I believe to be a real catalytic piece of research, I guess, to look at the whole evolution of how the city and water management in city evolved. And this was published in 2007. And really laid the foundation of what do we mean by a water-sensitive city. And we basically say that many cities, especially in the developed world, its evolution in water management actually is very linear. It is very reactive as well. Almost all cities in the world are actually located where they have access to good fresh water for water supply. That's usually how city starts. We call that the water supply city. As trade and population grow, you find that the way that the city manages dispose of its waste have caused significant problems with health, diseases, and so on. And it's through the sewering of the city that actually starts to address that public health issue. And you find that the city is progressively transitioned into what we call a sewered city. These are what we call an embedded continuum, whereby if you look at that, we start as a water supply city, we grow, we need to address the public health issue related to sewage, and we start to introduce sewering. Sewering has improved public health immensely, and cities grow. It grows into areas whereby it really in the issues of flood vulnerability, drainage becomes an issue because density increases, and we start to introduce another thinking in another infrastructure, and that's to provide drainage. The issue of flood protection and provision of drainage, and so on. And that was a continuum that helped us understand how cities evolve and how it could continue to evolve in the future as more and more challenges come through. But they're incredibly reactive. Our purpose was really to understand the historical transformation of cities and then ask the question, how do we use catalysts, events that occurs in our city to help us leapfrog some of those very linear transition. But if you look at the first three cities, and most cities in the world, most developed cities in the world, and most developing cities aspire to go to, you'll find that, in fact, if you look at the first three categories of cities, all their services infrastructure almost look the same because it is actually not context-specific. For instance, water supply, you find that often there's centralized water sourcing, some treatment delivered to our city. Quite often the source of water is outside our city. And we have big pipes and big tanks to bring the water in to our city. In a sewered city, you find that, nowadays in any developed world and developing world, you go to your toilet in the morning, flush the toilet, and away it goes. And underneath that servicing is actually a whole network of sewage infrastructure that collects our sewage to a treatment plant, treats it, and we dispose of it. And in terms of a drain city, the signature of a drain city is every time it rains, water runs on the road, goes into the drain, goes into our nearby waterways, and away it goes. And in fact, you find that almost every city you go to, this, in fact, is the signature of the three evolutional states. But as we move into a waterway city, which we were beginning to see many of the cities actually starting to look to better quality of the environment, better livability, you find that, in fact, they are different. Because now, as cities grow and evolve to become, say, a waterway city, it actually is responding to the context of the site. And so you find that the issues of water restoration, protection of our natural environment from stormwater pollution and wastewater pollution, in fact, it's quite different. Because now it is responding to the hydrology and the hydrologic characteristics of that city. And they're different. Before the commencement of the drought in Australia, we find that many Australian cities was actually moving into that space whereby perhaps the affluence of the community, the awareness of the community for better quality of life, environmental quality, was pushing government to reform, to actually look at waterway management and look at how natural waterways is an integral part of city shaping. Then we had the drought. And one of the things about the drought is that there was a lot of discussions in the city and in Australian cities and elsewhere in California, for instance, as to how do we address water scarcity. There was initiatives that said that, well, we should think about integrated water supply, and that perhaps, and the way I've sort of captured in this diagram, is that perhaps we are actually moving back to perhaps more confined, fundamental, less holistic way of looking at the way water is managed in a city. Centralized wastewater recycling, direct potable reuse, indirect potable reuse, due water supply reticulation, that really is an integrated water supply system. And there are some Australian cities that have transformed itself to do that. But it's very technologically driven. It is very much about water supply security in itself. There are some other cities in Australia that say, hey, hang on, we can think about integrated water supply by actually thinking about stormwater as a resource as well. And there are some cities that actually look at that. And to some degree, some of the cities that have gone that path have basically gone down that path completely in isolation from the consideration of environmental quality, stormwater management for quality improvement. Now, why I raise that point is that in New Zealand, what I hear, and I don't pretend to fully understand it, the Three Water Strategy is in fact an incredible catalyst with political support to rethink about how integrated water management can be delivered. The conversation could actually be about integrated water management for safer water supply, and to separate altogether the whole notion of freshwater agenda, freshwater reform, freshwater protection. Or you can actually start to think about not looking at a water supply-centric framing of how you look at integrated water management, but actually look at it from a water cycle perspective, which is actually in our continuum to say that, hey, if we actually start to think about a water cycle city, we can actually start to think about the totality of the three water streams in its true form. In my mind and my reflection in the last couple of days was that you have the political will to do that. It is how you structure your framework to deliver the three water strategy that actually includes the importance of environmental protection, freshwater enhancement as part of your water cycle city. This was the vision that was also created very much in 2007 when we talk about the city-state continuum. What is before you at the moment and the opportunity before you is to shape what a three water strategy would look like. Very important for safe drinking water, but if all your emphasis is narrowed down to the notion of delivering safe drinking water, you will and potentially be in a situation of merely perpetuating what is an old conventional thinking of urban water management. Or you can start to think about using that opportunity, the political will, to start to marry together what total water cycle management really means. And perhaps even go one step further and say, what does that mean in terms of a water-sensitive city? What does that mean in terms of water sensitivity? Whereby, again, in Australia, we are now saying that not only is it important to look at the servicing of the three waters that we have in our city, we are looking at how the servicing of that improves the livability of our city through heat mitigation. Many Australian cities are now predicting incredible heat wave conditions, and the role of water management and water in the landscape really have a significant influence in the microclimate of our city. Looking at the quality of bringing nature back into our city and ecological landscapes whereby, as we heard from yesterday's presentation, the use of biomimicry to actually introduce ecological function in your city, that your city can in fact provide ecosystem services to both the built environment and the natural environment. Why the natural environment? It is about buffering the impact of urbanization, buffering the impact of human population on the natural environment. That buffering is significantly amplified by the fact that we have climate change We have rising sea levels. There are ecological transformation whereby the natural rate of ecological transformation actually need to be protected by buffering that very high variability and intensity of climate variability that is now being imposed in our built environment and our natural environment. That is really the concept of a water-sensitive city. It is progressively moving from the notion of water management for life, the basic essentials of good, safe drinking water, protection from floods, and environmental protection, to one that is water for livability. Now, this is not new. It has been the thinking that's been developed, certainly in Australia and elsewhere in the world, but I'm really delighted to note that many parts of the world are, in fact, embracing that concept. China has its sponge city concept. Singapore has its ABC waters, active, beautiful, and clean water concept. In the United States, the low-impact development is evolving into a much more water-sensitive concept. Even the terminology of water-sensitive cities or water-sensitive urban design is now widely spread throughout the world because of its very holistic concept of looking at how water management in any context is sensitive to the challenges of the water environment in that context. And that sensitivity is really about water resources, both in terms of our access to reliable, clean water and the protection of the water environment that we live in. In 2011, the National Water Commission in Australia started to ask the question about what is the urban water of the future. It really was a signal to the water sector, particularly the water utility in Australia, to really start to get them to rethink about their remit, their organization, that their role is more than simply providing taps and toilets, the traditional role of the water utility. And so it was already trying to perhaps catalyze a new wave of reform in terms of how future water utilities ought to function. And they have this diagram, which is really very comparable, and I would like to think perhaps have sort of interpreted to some degree that city-state continuum that was published in 2007 that actually looks at the evolution of the role of the water utility from the traditional water and wastewater services at the bottom to a urban water cycle management that actually needs to think about stormwater as a resource, flood mitigation, catchment management, waterway health as part of really a fundamental role of water utility if they truly want to embrace the total water cycle management mantra, if they totally want to embrace the concept of three waters. And that there is really a need for water utilities and water managers to really be an active participant in city planning, in delivering livable cities, and that they do have a role through their servicing strategy to actually start to be a lot more context-specific in the way they look at servicing, water servicing in cities. So there is, in fact, the new wave of reform that has actually helped and certainly was one of the catalysts that led to the creation of the CRC for water sensitivity to actually look at how do we do that? How do we use water as a catalyst for reforming cities that looks at the social aspirations for greater livability? And I tell you that social aspirations for greater livability is currently in a tango, if you like, in a dance mode with government's desire to increase density. Many Australian cities, and I would imagine New Zealand cities, in fact, have a density that fundamentally is not sustainable. I've heard conversations that talk about how many of the arable land is actually being converted to urban development. And so the tension between actually starting to perhaps increase density for greater infrastructure efficiency need to be coupled with delivering greater livability, greater natural values in our city to enable that to coexist, for nature and city to coexist. I'd like to just draw your attention to this piece of work that the CRC put together. The CRC is fundamentally looking at how it can support Australian cities. But now and again, we sort of dab into this whole notion of being a think tank, and there were two pieces of work that we put together, one of which was this one that talks about what is water utility of the future. And Mark Pascoe yesterday talked about that, and I just want to sort of remind you that for those of you that are in the water utility, for those of you that are thinking about consolidating a number of small water utility into a bigger one, here's an opportunity for you to actually think about how you can transform your utility into a utility of the future. And the way we put this together really was quite simple. We just simply draw on the experience of water utilities in Australia, and each one of the water utility in Australia that we draw on, in fact, have little bit of work that could actually be seen as quite forward-looking. In itself, it seems like a very small thing to do, but collectively, we find that the water utility can play a role in the type of transformation of the water sector. And we provided some 19 examples, and the whole idea of providing those 19 examples, some of which are from state-owned enterprises, some of which are from municipally owned water utilities, and some are privately owned water utility. Not so much to boast about Australia, but to some degree, as we are right in the eve of the World Cup rugby, that's probably the only thing the Australian can boast about is our water utilities. But mainly to provide encouragement to all of you that there are always things that a water utility can do that continue to be progressive and to lead, to provide leadership. And we look at initiatives that are internal, and quite often they are about how you operate, how you become more efficient, how you look at the use of digital technology for improving your operation. But there are also external initiatives, how you collaborate with others, how water utility have such a fundamental role in working with local government. And of course, there are the pushing the boundary, creating new authorizing environment, redefining the remit of the role of utility. So we have a whole bunch of examples, and 19 of them, as I say, and they may not be exactly relevant to utilities elsewhere, but the challenges that they were trying to address are in fact the same. And it is really up to, and I invite you to read this and to reflect on how similar activities could be done as part of your operation in catalyzing change and reform within the water sector. So I just want to run through, I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about, there are a whole bunch of different case studies that we have from the state-owned enterprise, from municipally owned enterprise, and from private enterprise. And they are all simply just case studies to demonstrate that these things can be done, and that bits and pieces of little initiative can in fact be used to help the whole collective of the water industry transform itself as they come together. So what do you want to be? The Three Water Reform is a real catalyst for you to actually think about what the water sector in New Zealand could be. I put it to you that being an integrated water supply city is not enough, that you have the political will and the investment to actually start to think about leapfrogging, that you could at the very least be leapfrogging to a water cycle city, but you need to think about what that means and how do you integrate the issue of safe water supply, water resource in terms of your sewage management and stormwater management, as far as freshwater enhancement, as well as managing stormwater as a resource, come together for you to truly be a water cycle city. But can we be bold? Can we actually think about leapfrogging to a water sensitive city in the way you work with city planning, in the way you work with spatial planning, to actually introduce place-based solutions that deliver greater livability while strengthening your drinking water standards, strengthening your integrated water management? In Australia, we are also now looking for the next wave and the next catalyst for reform. And we are couching it to think about the way of saying that for us to truly deliver a sustainable city, a resilient city in the face of climate change, it is not enough for us to just think about water. We want to actually look at how we can empower cities to be transformative. And what we mean by being transformative is really given by this context. And this is the catalyst that many Australian cities are facing: growth. The whole notion of population growth and the desire to increase densification are now basically before us. And there is a pipeline of investment that actually looks at how major cities in Australia, as you can see in the map, are going to service that growth. One thing we do know is that that growth and the urban intensification doesn't occur uniformly. The timing of increased density and increased demand is sporadic. It's spatially distributed, and it does challenge the way we think about servicing that increasing demand associated with the growth. Melbourne and its population is expected to double in the next 15 to 20 years. And that doubling of density of population is going to be in isolated hotspots. How do we service that? How do we actually think about the way that we continue to maintain the operation of our existing infrastructure, but at the same time deliver the level of services in hotspots of high density throughout the city? The problem is exacerbated by climate change, whereby it amplifies the problems that we have in terms of our resource, whether it is water scarcity or whether there is more frequent occurrences of floods. Climate change and the uncertainty associated with that really requires to rethink about the way we operate our system. Optimization is great, but optimization quite often have fundamental assumptions of the stationarity of climate. That is, the statistical properties of climate remains a constant. And yet we know that the boundary conditions as a result of climate change have completely disrupted the whole concept of statistical relevance and statistical stationary. You know, the 100-year drought or the 100-year flood means absolutely nothing these days because of climate change. How do you actually build resilience into the city, and how do you take the opportunity of investment as a result of population growth to redirect and basically realign city servicing strategies that accommodate that? The agility of the water sector is paramount in our ability to deliver more resilient cities. There's technological breakthrough, and the rate at which technological breakthroughs are occurring is at a pace whereby the way we think about water infrastructure needs to keep pace with it. We cannot think of delivering water infrastructure on a 25-year, 50-year plan. We actually have to be a lot more nimble in our ability to harness emerging technology. And the concept of that aligns really well with the fact that urban intensifications are sporadic. They are also, they have their own phase of development, and that we should really think about how we service each hotspot in isolation that best deliver the functionality of our existing infrastructure by looking at a different way of servicing. And I'll expand on that a little while. But there is also, in Australia anyway, that significant shift in community expectations. Like I say, enhanced livability is becoming a very strong community expectation. It is also almost as viewed as a plausible trade-off between increasing density and increasing livability. If you can deliver better livability in the way you look at the sense of place, to look at you introducing natural systems back into your environment, community might be more receptive to the concept of urban intensification as a means of funding that desired infrastructure. So the way you actually start to think about bringing what for all of us think makes sense in terms of greater efficiency in our infrastructure, greater density, critical mass of funding to enable great quality spaces to be built. That needs to go hand in hand with meeting the desire of the community about greater livability, greater cooling, greater ability to enhance microclimate, greater connection with nature, so on and so forth. And another thing that's really important in Australia is that it's quite clear that government investment in infrastructure alone cannot keep pace with the growing demand. In fact, you see it all over the world, and I was just talking to Rosie Wayne the other day about the notion that population growth in our Asia-Pacific region, which is going to be the highest in the world, you will find that many of those countries that are reliant on multilateral loans to build their infrastructure can barely keep up with the growing middle class, let alone the fact that that growth will come with it a growth in informal settlements, the growth of the poor and vulnerable living in cities. And if we really are serious about thinking about leaving no man behind, you actually need to think about a much broader strategy of how you can deliver some of those services. So in Australia, we are actually in an era of what I call dynamic urban intensifications. And the interplay between city planning, water servicing, infrastructure investment, private sector participation and co-investment are all converging. How do you deliver that? And that is really the vision of what we're trying to do in the next iteration, if you like, of our work. And what is the definition of transforming cities? The way we look at it is actually, we are not talking about transforming cities. We are actually talking about creating cities that has the capacity to be transformative. And that really is about the social capital, the institutional capital, and the vision, and more importantly, the agility of its water infrastructure, in accommodating constant change, accommodating the demands of a changing climate, but also to harnessing and capturing the innovation of rapidly changing technology that is coming before us. And water, in fact, is an incredible catalyst for us to do that. We did a piece of analysis that looks at the Sustainable Development Goals, the whole 169 targets, and we simply asked the question, how many of the targets are actually influenced by the way we manage water? 50 of the 169 targets are directly impacted by the way we manage water. And another 34 are enabled by the way we manage water. So if you look at that equation, nearly half of the targets of the SDG is in one way or another related to the way we manage water. And therefore, I put it to you that leadership from you as the water sector is so important in laying some really solid foundation for all of us to achieve our aspirations in SDGs. I'll just finish off by basically saying, well, how do we think we can do that? How do we actually start to look at sweating the assets that we have, but using the catalyst of new investments because of population growth and urban intensification to actually start to redirect the trajectory of our cities into a water-sensitive cities? And there are three key things that I want to talk about. The notion of hybrid solutions, that the solutions are now very much hybrid, multifunctional, multidimensional. The importance of digital technology and how that is going to enable the hybridization of our infrastructure to operate as one. And finally, the notion of circular economies, which we heard about, but I put it to you that the circular economy is very much linked to the way we look at spatial planning. I think I'll start with the notion that, in fact, our cities, and we need to recognize that our cities are social technical construct. I don't know which one started first, whether the institutions that govern our infrastructure or the infrastructure itself, but they self-reinforce. Because of the evolution of our city in such a linear way in the past, you find that our institutions, the way we manage water, is incredibly fragmented because of the remit and the design requirements of our infrastructure as it evolves. So you have the water supply department because water supply was the first remit of our city. Then we have our sewage department because sanitation was the next. And then even to this day, drainage is completely separate out from water supply or sewage because, first of all, it is seen as a public good. There's no money in it. It's hard to raise money for it, and it gets carved off. If you look at what's happening in the UK during the privatization era, what do they privatize? They privatized water supply and sewage. And what did they leave behind for government because it was a community good, as if it is not part of it? Drainage, flood management, waterways. And what do we now do? How do we unscramble that egg for those countries that have in fact privatized their water sector? How do you actually deliver integrated water cycle management whereby 2 of the 3 water streams are now privatized and one is sitting with government still trying to figure out how they're actually going to provide the funding base for it? The opportunity of the 3-water scheme actually is also the opportunity to really think about how those 3 need to work together off a very similar funding base. So the technology itself is not going to solve the problem. Understanding the institutional capital and understanding how you bring community with you as part of the social capital for delivering your 3 water strategies is just so important. And then there is the hybrid of centralized, decentralized systems. And this is a piece of work done by JHD in Melbourne, in Sydney. Sorry, oh, that was such a slip in that other city in Australia, Sydney, that actually looks at the growth of the CBD and actually look at where the increased water demand is, and then identify that is where you can actually start to couple the centralized with the decentralized water servicing strategy, both in terms of sewage management and in terms of water supplying, local recycling at local hotspots to create hybrid solutions. Now, getting a decentralized system to operate with a centralized system requires some smarts. The technology, the digital technology, great sensors are now enabling us to actually think about how the coupling can actually deliver much more efficient services that continue to operate the existing system with an increased demand at that local spot. I'll give an example, which is an example I like to use in Melbourne because I know it well. The Fisherman's Bend development is twice the size of the CBD, is a conversion of industrial precincts into a high-value mixed-use precinct that will ultimately house something like 80,000 residents and another 80,000 or so of transient people that will come in because of the mixed use of that space. The solution that was undertaken, the really rigorous analysis was undertaken by Southeast Water, which is the water servicing authority for this region, basically look at the concept of do we augment the water supply systems around us, Thompson Dam, another desalination plant, pipes coming in, or do we actually start to look at introducing a local infrastructure into this place to create that hybrid solution in this case from a water supply perspective. And because Melbourne being at the bottom of the system, huge sewer running to a sewer pump that pumps it to our wastewater treatment plant, there was a great opportunity to actually think about sewer mining as a way of a local recycling. And at the same time, there was great opportunity to look at how local grey water mining can actually also be used to basically increase the level of water recycling at a very small loop within this precinct as a way of creating a buffering to the demands of the centralized infrastructure of water supply in this case. It's not just water supply, but what was done and after some rigorous analysis was in fact to show that the water footprint of this development that's going to have about 4 times its normal population has been reduced by 45%. What that means is that there is a great opportunity to defer any augmentation in infrastructure. That's the first thing. So that's the business case. Secondly, it buys us time to think about increasing the way we look at water recycling with new technology, but also with community receptivity to how recycled water is being used. It buys us time. And we were really confident that within the next 25 years, which is the development lifespan of this development, that there will be emerging technology that ultimately will reduce its water footprint down to maybe 20-25%, which is the current water demand and wastewater discharge of the system. What does that mean? It also delay or avoid the need to upgrade your pump station that will pump sewage to a sewage treatment plant. It will also reduce or delay any need for augmentation of your sewage treatment plant for this increased demand. So that hybridization is actually now basically trying to extend the useful life of your existing infrastructure while creating a different trajectory for development. Now, this is one of 2 major inner city development in Melbourne. The second one is at Arden Macaulay. And this concept is really demonstrating now how through the progressive renewal of a city, you can actually lay all the foundation for its transformation into a more sustainable, more resilient city. Another example of hybridization is, of course, the green and gray infrastructure. Again, I use this case study whereby this is an industrial precinct whereby there are some existing stormwater drainage pipes. Because it's an industrial precinct, its level of serviceability is quite low. It's a 1 in 5 year frequency of inundation on the road and so on. But as it's being lifted to become a mixed-use, high-value residential estate, the design standard needs to be increased, whereby drainage functionality needs to ensure that no streets are being flooded up to 1 in 20 years. The normal way we approach this is to rip all the pipes out, put in some bigger new pipes, and so on. But by introducing a green infrastructure as an overlay to buffer that system, we found that the existing infrastructure can deliver the new level of service, a 1 in 20 year, by buffering. And by that, we were able to demonstrate that there was, in fact, a 25% reduction in infrastructure enhancement from what it could be. How do you go about doing this? Because when you start to do things about integrating water servicing, drainage management, livability together, you really need to think about what the new institution and new governance would look like. So vertical government integration, community co-designs are fundamental to this. So I'd like to sort of summarize by saying that hybrid solutions, in fact, provide us with the way of really creating a new trajectory for our cities to support urban consolidation, which is the way urban intensification is happening at the moment, avoid or defer major trunk infrastructure, embrace opportunities provided by emerging technology, provided opportunity because of it being piecewise for greater public-private investment, co-investments. And really, it is really, in our thinking, fundamental to delivering a whole-of-government strategy for our cities. Now, with the time I have, I know that I've run out of time. I just want to make 2 comments. One is about the circular economy. Really important. We've heard about it. We heard about the opportunity of how perhaps, again, the water sector can provide some leadership in this whole area of circular economy. But I put it to you that the circular economy is best delivered if we actually think of it from an industrial ecology perspective. And that is that because urban intensifications is piecewise, we actually need to think about how urban planning, spatial planning, can actually cluster the way water demands and water uses are together, such that there are little loops within a city. A circular economy in a city is actually about little loops within a city rather than one big loop for the whole city. I've got a whole bunch of other things I want to talk about, but I think I've run out of time. A description of what those loops look like was my next slide. I think I don't have time to talk through it other than to say that there's so many cascading use of water that we can think about within the city before we even think about discharging it and or recovering it as the end. Now, these are the type of things that we can talk about whereby the little loops of circular economy in water should be embedded as part of your spatial planning. And what do we do then in terms of the role of the water energy nexus? How do we look at water and energy recovery and use within those little loops? And what about nutrients? How do we actually think about delivering the type of urban agriculture and so on within that? A lot to talk about. I've run out of time. I apologize. Thank you so much for listening.